welcome to the stage Sherveen Uduwana, award-winning designer and producer based out of California, lead producer of the award-winning puzzle platform From Light, also lead mission designer of We Are Caretakers, which sounds like a really cool game. And yeah, I think I just want to give you as much time as you want to talk about persistence and resistance. So yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks so much.
Go
And
ahead.
thanks to Eunice as well for like an amazing first talk to kick things off as well. It's really fun to listen to. So yeah, I'm here to talk a bit about narrative and roguelikes, how I feel like it's currently underutilized. And I think this is a really great kind of continuation of this talk where I think a lot of the points that Eunice were making we can also kind of apply as and thinking about roguelikes as a broader narrative tool than simply in games. So I'm Sherveen. That's my Twitter handle right there. And oh, whoop, there's the button. Okay. So a little bit about me. My pronouns are he, him. I make games. I do a lot of freelance game development. I also teach games as well with Code Coven. My latest project is a roguelike. It's called Mid Autumn. So here's a slide about it a bit. Okay, I guess GIFs don't work in this particular view, but this is a logo about it, and it's coming to Steam Early Access next year. So if folks want to go wishlist it, I'd really appreciate it. It absolutely helps me out. But let's talk about what I wanted to talk about today. A few disclaimers. This entire talk is really full of opinions. It isn't meant to be seen as the quote unquote correct way to do things. But I think my intent here is to point out approaches I think have a lot more room to be explored in roguelikes in terms of narrative and things that I personally find compelling that I don't really see a lot of. So it's a very self-indulgent talk. So I hope you'll bear with me. Yeah, I think roguelikes are one of my favorite ways to tell stories in general. One of the reasons for that is that I think they are especially suited for the types of stories that games as a medium can often struggle with. And the types of stories that I'm particularly fascinated with are often stories about systemic change, systemic narratives, sociological narratives that are about like particular moments in time or societies or things like that, as opposed to being so focused on kind of an individual character. And I think a lot of the inherent elements of roguelikes do a lot of heavy lifting for you in these situations. So I think one of the unique qualities of games in particular as a narrative medium is that players are often forced to create a mental model of the game, like the systems you're interacting with, in order to then experience the narrative. I think other mediums also do this. I just think it's very overt in games. And I think that that's very interesting and compelling to work with because you can use these mental models as part of your storytelling, and the fact that players are very consciously engaging with this. So I think some unique elements of roguelikes you might defer on your preference of what elements make something a roguelike. But I think about the intentional removal of progress a lot. I also think about procedural elements. I think about randomness and what sorts of stories lend themselves to that. So this is a chance for me to do a bit of a tangent and talk about a bit of music theory that I think about when I think about roguelikes a lot, and just that cyclical repetitive nature. And there's this term which is that repetition legitimizes. I've put here an image of a Voronoi pattern. If folks don't know what a Voronoi pattern is, you'll notice that it looks kind of like weird and strange, but when you see it all in context, you can see that there is clearly a pattern being repeated here, and you can kind of feel that there's something programmatic going on here. So if folks are new to making roguelikes, I absolutely encourage you to also Google this. It's a very useful pattern for noise and randomness and certain types of generation. But there's this idea that, like, let's say in jazz music, if you hear a note and it sounds like the quote wrong note, that might sound unpleasant to you, but hearing that same note repeated multiple times can contextualize it and make you feel like, oh, this was supposed to be here. This was intentional. And I think another aspect of that is that genre expectations can make things feel normal or legitimate or sound off. So the types of things you can get away with in jazz very different than the types of things you get away with rock music or classical music, and defines what we experience as correct or incorrect. So I think that the way that repetition occurs in roguelikes also allow us to kind of use this legitimizing factor to do some really interesting narrative risks that you can't do in some other genres. So this is the rest of this talk is going to be super anecdotal. I'm just going to point out some stories or things that I think are really interesting outside of games, and that I think could be really interesting to explore in terms of like roguelikes. And talk a bit about how characters. Wait, what is this? Oh, sorry. These slides are slightly wrong, I guess. Ignore these last two bullet points. I don't know how I copied this here. But let's talk a bit about some games. So let's say you wanted to make a game about class struggle, and it's set in revolutionary France, or something like Les Mis. I think you could make a really cool roguelike about something like this. And I think you could make something that is much more than just like an action game with the trappings of revolutionary France, which I think is a lot more common that what you see in games, where we're not really exploring a lot of these ideas that you would find in the book. But I think you could make a really effective roguelike about this for a number of reasons. I think because of the repetitive cyclical nature, you don't have to rely on a singular protagonist the way that a lot of other genres and games do. As you do different runs, it allows you to have differences between your characters, which means you can explore things like social context or class or things like that, and how these different characters and the textures of these characters influence the events of gameplay, and how they interact with your narrative. The other thing that I really like about roguelikes is the expectations of failure. Failure feels very different in roguelikes, and I think there's less of a desire to optimize for success in the same way, at least like in terms of overall genre expectations. I think sometimes players going into it can still want to succeed, but I think that is really, really helpful in allowing for bad things to happen to your characters. I think in a lot more linear games, I think we've all potentially had a scenario where you get through the end of like a sequence in a game and you're doing really well, and then a cutscene pops up and your character gets ambushed and like knocked out or something, or they fail in some way, and there's a dissonance there. And I think that roguelikes are very, very effective in letting you avoid that dissonance while still allowing moments of failure in your narrative, which allows for a more complex and dynamic narrative overall. So these are some examples of games that I think kind of already explore this. I really like the way that it happens in The Swindle, where you kind of lose your character if you fail a heist, and then you have a new character that you have to like level up, and it's a question of can you pull off the things you need to do in time. I think Rogue Legacy also has some interesting elements there. Spoilers, I'm going to also be talking about some things that are like roguelites, or like things that aren't explicitly roguelikes, because I think the point of this talk is that I think some of these things are underutilized in roguelikes. So I think these are things that could be also applied from different games as well. And so like Rogue Legacy, you have like you're playing as your descendants of your character. So you have this kind of overall experience of making progress and having kind of unique quirks with each character that you have to know about. And I think Wildermyth also does a similar thing with the kind of feel and vibes of the characters influencing how they respond to like similar events. All right, so let's talk about another example. Let's say instead of that, you want to make a game that's about like an artist struggling to maintain their creative and religious integrity in like a period of time in Russia where there's a big conflict between Christianity and paganism. I'm talking about a very specific movie, which is a Tarkovsky film from the 60s called Andrei Rublev. Which I really like. It's very like not like a type of thing that I would sit down and watch like with popcorn, but very, very cool. Some really cool narrative stuff going on in here, and I think you could make a cool roguelike about something like this. Here's why. So I think repetition, like we were talking about, in cyclical content, I think players experience it very differently in roguelites than in other genres. For folks who haven't seen this movie, it has a lot of like vignettes and like asynchronous stuff, like jumping around in time. So I think that like less reliance on like a single authoritative run, like linear run, means you can use different runs to explore kind of seemingly disparate or unrelated ideas and still have that context overall. And this is why I call the talk like persistence and endurance. I think that the struggle and endurance in roguelikes align very well with what we expect from the gameplay. And also I think you're much more likely to find players who vibe with those themes and expectations. They might not necessarily like be into like Tarkovsky films, but I think the themes behind them can be very, very compelling as well. And you can find like those kinds of elements. Some games that I think kind of explore this. I think Cultist Simulator does some interesting things where depending on what you do, the gameplay can be very, very different. We have some games here that aren't like fully roguelikes. Like Outer Wilds, I would say is more of a time loop game. Rain World is more of like an authored kind of survival game. But I think they also have these elements of, depending on how you interact with these systems, it can be very, very unique and different. And I think that I would love to see something that feels more like a roguelike that also has these elements, like more things like that. The last example here, which I'm going to go through pretty quickly, is kind of like looking at unreliable narrators. So let's say you want to make something about like the lack of human ability to be impartial about ourselves, or the philosophy of justice. So something like Rashomon or something like that. I think repeated runs allows you to experience unreliable narrators in a really, really interesting way, and lets you kind of distill what is objective and what isn't over time as you kind of repeat these structures. I think like Rashomon, or maybe like In a Bamboo Grove, a lot of these types of stories kind of fall outside of Western storytelling tropes, which have like kind of very distinct like beginning, middle, ends, or like causal chains of events, which you don't always find in other cultures. And I think roguelikes work really well for that because of like the use of randomness, because of the fact that they don't necessarily have to resolve as tidily as some other narratives. So those are just some of my favorite things. Those are some just examples. I hope that some other games that I think explore this in an interesting way are like games like Stanley Parable or Her Story. But I haven't really found a roguelike that I think of as a definitive example of these things, and I don't see why. I don't see why the genre isn't full of like these types of games. So we'll just go into like some final thoughts. Those are just a bunch of high level anecdotes. But I think if you ever hear people talking about like roguelikes being like an overdone genre at this point, which some people say these days, I think that that's kind of a silly idea. I think there's lots of new ground we still haven't broken, especially in terms of narrative and those kinds of elements. That's what I think about a lot. And very, very selfishly, I hope that folks kind of take this talk and think about how to make more roguelikes in the future that like take advantage of the genre's trappings and tell really interesting stories. And this especially goes for creators from marginalized groups. I want to see all your roguelikes. I think non-mainstream stuff is very, very cool and particularly supported by this genre in certain ways. So I'm excited to see it. I hope if folks end up making something after watching this talk, please let me know. And like my final thought is like, is there a story you think would make a cool game, but it doesn't feel like it would quite work? I think it's a really, really good practice to check. Do you think that making something a roguelike would make it work better as a narrative? I think I do that a lot as a fun exercise, and it leads to a lot of interesting design ideas. So I would throw that to you as well. I think last minute, I will also show this again, broken GIF of Mid-Autumn. Please do go wishlist it if you can. It's very helpful for me to be able to like implement a lot of my narrative ideas about roguelikes. And I think that's it for me. Thanks everyone. Thanks for letting me chat with you. I will throw it to questions or overflow rooms or things like that at this point.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think you timed it perfectly. We got 1 minute, so we'll have to. I think you'll be in Mage for overflow room questions, which would be great. But yeah, I love provoking the question of not asking, is it a roguelike, but could it be a roguelike? And yeah, I think it's wonderful. I know when we were looking at the submission, and it was just the concept of like Rashomon roguelikes. We were like, yes, this talk, go. Very excited. So yeah. Wonderful stuff.
I just think I'm always so surprised that there isn't like a Rashomon-esque roguelike. I'm like, why isn't that like a thing that is very obviously comes to my brain?
Yeah, it's wonderful. And I think in chat there were more ideas people were having of like, oh, and this would be an interesting roguelike. So I'm looking forward to the discussion after it. But